This is the third episode of our Mach 3 overview, and we're going to review these icons in this top menu and the ones across the bottom here, and then talk a little bit about the right-click menu. So what I want to start with is something I just noticed for the first time, is here in this top menu bar, there's some information about the pattern that you have selected on the screen. And so if I went to transform with this, you can see that in the transform menu, it tells me it's 10 by 31 inches, and which is repeated here, but that the actual length of the sewing is 178 inches, which I think is very interesting. So let's go ahead and set this up as an edge to edge, and I'll nestle those down a little bit tighter. If I select them all, it gives me a total length, and I think this is probably something we should be using to charge customers because it's far more accurate than a square inch number. It actually tells us how much thread is going to be used and how long the actual stitch path is. So I think that's worth some discussion that we consider that, and there may be ways to sort of compute number of bobbins from that. So I'm sure there's some engineer minds out there that have thought that through and might have some good feedback. So moving along in this, a lot of these icons are repeats of icons that you have elsewhere or in the file menu. So if I hover over, it tells me what it does. This is add to pad. So it takes me straight to my pattern pad so I can select patterns and place them on the pattern pad. So this is undo and redo, which are also Control Z. And if you want to know your keyboard shortcuts, redo is Control Y, so I can go up here and it tells me those same keyboard shortcuts. So you can either use these key combinations or these buttons to undo and redo. This is delete, so whatever is selected, I can delete it. So let me accept my edge to edge. So if I have something selected, it would delete. Control Z brings it back. And then this is copy paste. So if I have something, again, let's accept this and get out of this. Let's go ahead and delete these. I'll bring on this pattern. So if I want to copy paste, it gives me a second copy and I can move that around. Also on your right click menu, copy, delete, or right there, undo, redo, and more repeats. So if I wanted to select this and do more repeats, it would add on my screen. So just shortcuts to some of the other tools that you have elsewhere. Zoom in and zoom out. So that's out as far as I can go. If I zoom in, you can see that I get new grids and I can keep zooming in and ultimately they'll split up into more. If you want to view the actual size, this is a full view, will show you the whole quilt. Actual size will show you how it's actually going to turn out, and it's a good idea to sort of be hovered in on that. So these are approximately 1 inch at that point, but you can calibrate that. We'll talk about that next week. So this would, if you wanted to show customer the actual density, you would use the actual size. This one, these two icons have a red line around them. When they're activated, there's a green line. In programs, other graphics programs, if I marqueed around, say, this Jeep with it, it would zoom in on that. This works more like this other zoom in icon. It doesn't really pick an area and zoom in on that. So I'm going to turn that back to red. The pan icon, if you hold your roller wheel down on your mouse, it becomes a pan tool. So then I can move around my quilt by holding that roller wheel, pushing it down. But this does the same thing, so it becomes this arrow and I can pan around. But to get rid of it, I have to click that back to red. Pattern center can be useful for placement. So if I click on that, it gives me the center points of the pattern. And more repeats again here. If I'm trying to set up a border, fewer repeats. And then the mirror option flips it upside down, horizontal reflection. This is a vertical reflection, would do it side to side. So if I wanted to get some variation in the pattern. And then the final icon here is your reverse sew. So if you watch this green and the red, I can reverse it. So kind of quick access to some tools that you use frequently. If I wanted to remove one of these icons from this bar, I could right click and either remove it or change the color on the background. So If I wanted to turn that to green, I certainly could. So there's some flexibility there. Okay, moving on through the icons across the bottom here. The first one is something that you also have on your Mach 3 screen, and it's called Power Assist. And if I click it, you can hear the motors engage. So there's a slight noise associated with it. And the head, if I barely touch it, can become very responsive. So the idea is that it loosens up the head to where it's easier to move around like it was not on belts. And there's some calibrations that you can do. I'm going to click it off. If I go into the help menu and into the diagnostics, there's some calibrations right here, and we're going to talk more about that in the final class. But what I find is that people will click this and not realize it's on, and they barely touch the head and it goes flying across the table. So it can be a little bit touchy, and I would just caution you that it can bump into your rollers if it takes off on you. And so you can try to use that if it makes it easier to click, say, push pins or use one of the other tools. We tend not to use it because it wants to sort of overshoot, but it's certainly worth exploring if you would like. These next two icons are a little confusing to people, especially who are new to the machines. So let's start with the sew zone, the blue icon. When you load your backing and start maybe basting on your quilt top, if that's how you do it, you'll want to set up your sew zone. So at the beginning of every quilt, you will set this up. And it's basically the safety zone where your head knows it's not safe to go off the edge of that, because if it came back on, you could certainly tear a quilt, which would be a bad thing. So the sew zone, we think of it basically as the size of your backing. And we usually will set it when we're sort of in the middle of the quilt basting, because if you have red snappers at the top edge, sometimes that will reduce your sew zone size. So you'll set that up one time per quilt, and then if you switch to a different quilt, you'll reset it up for the new quilt. And other than that, you won't need to set the sew zone throughout the rest of the project. So it's your safe zone. Your reposition you want to do as you start the project. So let's say I've basted my entire quilt, I've set my sew zone on this, and I've now rolled back to the upper corner. The computer has no way of knowing where the quilt is on your table. So you have to tell it that. And so we usually will reposition to this top corner of the quilt, and I've got my head where that corner is on my actual table, and I'll say apply. And so that tells it where the quilt is positioned, and then I'll move the head around and use my crosshairs to just double check that everything's going to quilt where I think it's going to. So one time sew zone at the beginning of each project. The reposition you're going to do as you roll the quilt, and when we do that, we generally will pick some place here in the middle. So if this row just stitched, I'll find a sharp point, so maybe the tip of this key or this point right here, and I will then reposition to that, move my head to that same point, and apply it. So I'm not going to do that right now since my head's not in that spot. And so it's always easiest to find a hard point at the bottom in the middle, because you assume that you have shrinkage on each end. So the next three icons are pretty obvious. If I wanted to send my pattern to the machine to begin stitching, I would hit go, and the lightning stitch screen will change and will say continue. When you hit that once, it will move to the beginning of the pattern. You do your pickup, and then you hit continue again, and it begins stitching. So if you need to stop after you've started quilting, you would hit the stop, and that would take you back into an edit menu, or you would hit pause, which will just stop the machine. You'll hear the motors still, and then if you hit start again, it will just start right back where it was. So, if you have to step away from your machine and you need to watch things, hit pause and then step away. This icon is your channel locks, and so it might look a little bit different if you have one of the heads that came before the Mach 3 series, or the M24 series. And so on the M24s, if you click it, it will show you that the head is locked in a vertical path. So now I can only move my head vertically. I cannot move it horizontally. If I click it again, it locks it in a horizontal path, so I can move my head horizontally but not vertically. It's actually locked. And you'll hear the motors engage and know that that's on. If you click it again, and neither of these are highlighted, then it's unlocked. So certainly useful for lining up a quilt if you're trying to keep things square. This icon is your camera check icon. So if you had a webcam plugged in, I have my just the webcam on my computer that shows, but if you had a webcam plugged in that you were looking at the back of the quilt, that's where you could see the tension on your stitches. Check your stitches and make sure that they're okay. We've talked about this a little bit with using magnifying mirrors and LED lights and handheld cameras and cell phones. Lots of great options on that where we used to have none. So the final icon, let me go ahead and get rid of some of this so it's not quite so busy, is your sew options. And so if you bring that up, you can choose some things on a click here. So if I wanted to reverse the direction of that row, I could say click that and then click on the row, and you'll see that this will turn to red. So it changes the direction of the stitch, or it will cue or decue depending on what you choose. And then the sewing preview here will, if I start it, will start stitching the pattern out as it's going to stitch. And so I can speed that up or slow it down and then pause it or stop it. And I think it will show, let me start it again. There's a blue line over here that is what's called a no-sew line. So when it comes to the end of this row, it will travel here and be able to start stitching that. So if you see these blue lines, they're basically jump stitches or no-sew lines that show you the path that the patterns are going to take. If I, let me stop it, if I reverse sew this second row, you'll see that it's going to end here and then travel all the way down here to restart. So it just gives you an idea how things are going to move around. Let's say I've been messing with the border and I've brought a pattern in and copied it and maybe placed it in a sequence that doesn't make sense for stitching. It places the stitches in the sequence that you placed it. So this would be first, this would be second, this would be third. If I'm in that sew option, I can order it. So if I click on that and then click on the first one, the second one, the third one, it will reorder those. But you see that the start and stop still show, which means that the machine is going to pause between those. So it would be better for me to go ahead and go back to my group icon and say link. Then when I click them in the order I want them to sew, they'll sew as one continual pattern. So back to the sew options. Some additional ordering things that you can do here if you've got more patterns placed on the screen on how they're going to stitch out. You can cue all or decue all. And then there's this tie-off thing. And what I'm going to say to you right now is that you probably just want to ignore this. The tie-offs are enabled if you have the embroidery module in place. But what I found here is if I have this activated, let me go ahead and see if I go to try to send this, it will tell me that it can't tie off, so that it's disabled. So I think this is something probably for a future release that will work. I will tell you that we've covered this once before. If you want to create a tie off in something, you can come in, zoom way in, and go to your draw menu. And you would do this only at the beginning and the end of the row. So let's go to draw. You get these little vertices, and if I wanted to create a tie off, I can pull the second one. I never touch the first or the last. So I'll pull the second one, bring the third one there, pull the second one back up. So that would back tack. So it's a way that you can create a tie off if you want, but just don't do that before you put something into repeat, because that will be on every single repeat in the row. Okay, now we'll talk about the right click options. So if I have a pattern selected and I right click, it gives me choices. And again, they're repetitive from what's up here. I can copy, delete, undo, redo, do more repeats, less repeats, mirror, and flip as we have here, reverse sew, same as we have up here. Select all, choose pattern center. If I click that again, it turns off. I can add a push pin. I can add an image, and I'll talk about this more next week. I don't have anything on here that I can bring in right now, but it's a way to design over a quilt. And so it's something that we've talked about in one of the early videos, but I can certainly revisit that. I can unlock, lock, Q or DQ, putting it in line for stitching. Group and ungroup, which we spoke about last week, which is a way to temporarily group things to where you can move them around as one, or ungroup them and stitch them out. So that's not to be confused with permanently combining them. And then the group manager, which is down here. And so if I click on that, it shows me the patterns I have. And I can select newest first or oldest first to resort these. So this is a way, if I had a bunch of patterns on here and I needed to get to just one, that I could drill down into that one repeat or that one row. So if you click on this plus arrow, I can come in and change these. I could lock it, DQ it by hitting reverse, it brings up all these different choices. So it's a way to kind of manipulate things in the order that they're going to stitch. So that is it for the right, I did want to say one other thing about the right click menu. It does become responsive for certain tools. So let's say I was creating a boundary here and clicking on my screen. So I'll say done. If I right click now, there's a responsive part of the right click menu, so it comes up with boundary, and it allows me to rename that, to choose the type, what I want to do with the pattern that I'm placing into it, which pattern I want to put into it. So this changes depending on what tool you're in. The first choice will be responsive sometimes to specific tools. So that's it for the right click menu. Next week we'll cover some of the other menu options across here, and I'll review the putting a photo in as well.